The first thing I heard wasn't shouting. It was my son's trembling voice. "I don't know where Dad keeps it. I swear." I froze just inside the front door, my hand still gripping my briefcase. The familiar smell of fresh coffee mixed with something colder. Panic. My living room was silent except for the creaking floorboards beneath my mother's shoes. She stood over my son with an expression I'd never seen before. Her finger was pointed inches from his face. "Stop lying to me," she hissed. "We know your father keeps important papers somewhere in this house." My son sat curled into the corner of the couch, hugging his knees so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His eyes were swollen from crying. Behind them, my older brother had every drawer in my home office pulled open. File folders covered the floor like fallen leaves. Cabinet doors hung wide open, and family photo albums had been tossed aside without a second thought. Then I heard him whisper, "Find the deed before he gets back." For a moment, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. This wasn't a robbery. These weren't strangers. This was my own family tearing apart the house I had spent 15 years building. The house my late wife and I had struggled to buy after working, double shifts and sacrificing vacations, holidays, and almost every luxury most people took for granted. The same house where my son had taken his first steps. The same house where my wife had spent her final Christmas before cancer stole her away. And now my mother stood there, threatening the only piece of her daughter-in-law that still remained, our child. Neither of them noticed me standing in the hallway. My brother laughed quietly while flipping through another stack of documents. "He never trusted banks," he muttered. "The deed has to be here somewhere." My stomach tightened, so this had never been about visiting their grandson. Not about checking on me after months of silence. Not even about family. They had come hunting for ownership. For years my mother had hinted that the house should stay within the family. She believed my older brother deserved it because he had fallen on hard times too many times to count. I always ignored the comments. Today I realized they had stopped being comments. They had become a plan. My son finally looked toward the hallway. His terrified eyes met mine. He didn't scream. He didn't run. Relief washed over his face so suddenly that tears spilled down his cheeks. At that exact moment, my mother slowly turned around. Our eyes locked. Every excuse she might have prepared disappeared before she spoke a single word. The silence between us was louder than any argument could ever be. "My name is Daniel Harper, and until that afternoon, I believed the worst thing my family had ever done was make me feel invisible. I was 42, owned a small construction company, and had spent most of my adult life cleaning up problems other people created. When my father died, I paid for the funeral because my brother claimed he was broke. When my mother's roof leaked, I fixed it without sending a bill. I convinced myself that family wasn't measured by gratitude, but by responsibility. My older brother, Ryan, had always been the favorite. He was charming when he needed money, and impossible to find when anyone else needed help. Somehow, every failure in his life became someone else's fault, and my mother defended him every single time. If he borrowed money and never repaid it, she called him unlucky. If I refused another loan, she called me selfish. After my wife, Emily, passed away from cancer 4 years earlier, my world narrowed to one purpose: raising our son in the home we had fought so hard to keep. Every wall held a memory she helped create, and every room reminded me why I refused to sell. No matter how often my mother suggested I should move on, they mistook my quiet nature for weakness. Because I rarely argued, they assumed I never noticed the manipulation. Because I stayed calm, they believed I would always surrender to keep the peace. They never understood that silence isn't the same as surrender. Sometimes it's patience, and patience has a way of exposing people long before it defeats them. Looking back, that afternoon hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the ending of a pattern I had ignored for years. My mother had started asking strange questions months earlier. Whenever she visited, her eyes lingered on the hallway, leading to my office a little longer than they should have. She would casually ask where I kept important paperwork. Smiling as though it were nothing more than conversation, I always answered vaguely, and she would simply nod before changing the subject. Ryan was even less subtle. He joked that my house was too big for just 2 people, and laughed when he said I should let him move in for a while. The laugh never reached his eyes. They stayed fixed on the walls, the backyard, and the detached garage, silently measuring what everything might be worth. One Sunday dinner, I noticed my office door wasn't fully closed. Ryan stepped out carrying nothing, but he paused when he saw me watching. He smiled, patted my shoulder, and claimed he had been looking for the bathroom. The excuse sounded rehearsed, and my mother quickly redirected the conversation. Before I could ask another question, My son noticed more than either of them realized. After their visits, he quietly asked why Grandma kept opening drawers that didn't belong to her. I told him she was probably absent-minded, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't believe them. The warning signs were always there. I simply chose trust over suspicion, never imagining that the people who shared my name would one day see my home not as a place filled with memories, but as something waiting to be claimed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush across the room or demand explanations. Instead, I walked to my son, placed a hand on his shoulder, and quietly asked him to wait outside on the front porch. He looked at me for a second, searching my face for panic. Finding none, he nodded and left without a word. Only after the front door closed behind him did I turn back toward my mother and Ryan. Neither of them apologized. Ryan slowly lowered the folder he had been holding, while my mother straightened her jacket as if the problem wasn't what they had done, but that they had been interrupted. "We were just looking for some paperwork," she said calmly. Not "we're sorry," not "this isn't what it looks like," just another excuse. That single sentence erased years of doubt. I finally understood that they didn't believe they had crossed a line. In their minds, this house was already half theirs, and I was simply standing in the way of what they thought they deserved. I glanced across the room. Empty drawers hung open. Family photographs lay scattered across the floor. One picture of Emily had been knocked face down beside a stack of legal files. Ryan stepped over it without even noticing. Something inside me became perfectly still. For years, I had mistaken forgiveness for strength. I kept giving second chances because I wanted my son to grow up believing family could heal. But standing in that room, I realized another lesson mattered even more. Sometimes protecting your family means protecting them from your own relatives. Without saying another word, I reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone. The emergency call I had placed the moment I walked through the front door was still connected. The dispatcher quietly asked, "Sir, are they still inside the residence?" I looked directly at my mother before answering. "Yes," I said evenly. "And they have exactly nowhere left to go." In the distance, faint police sirens began to grow louder. The expressions on their faces changed for the first time that day, and I knew the balance of power had finally shifted. The sirens weren't the beginning of my revenge. They were simply the moment my preparation became visible. Running a construction company had taught me one lesson above all others. Never rely on memory when evidence can speak for itself. Every contract I signed, every property record I stored, and every security system I installed followed that principle. Long before that afternoon, I had upgraded the house with discreet cameras after expensive tools, disappeared from one of my job sites. They recorded every entrance, every hallway, and every room where important documents were kept. While the officers separated us and took statements, I remained calm. I answered every question directly, without adding anger or speculation. The footage would explain far more than emotion ever could. Later that evening, after my son was safely staying with a trusted neighbor, I contacted both my attorney and my insurance provider. My lawyer advised me not to argue with my family or respond to the flood of messages that had already begun appearing on my phone. Instead, we preserved every voicemail, every text, and every missed call. People often reveal the truth when they believe panic will erase consequences. The security recording showed Ryan opening locked file cabinets, my mother pressuring my son for information, and both of them searching rooms they had no permission to enter. We also documented the damaged furniture and the scattered legal files before touching a single thing. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to repair the damage they caused. I was allowing the facts to stand exactly as they were. They had built their own case, one quiet decision at a time, and all I had to do was let the evidence tell the story. The consequences arrived exactly the way my attorney predicted. Slowly, quietly, and impossible to undo. A few weeks later, we sat in a conference room while the security footage played on a large screen. No dramatic speeches were necessary. The recording captured my mother cornering my son, Ryan pulling files from locked cabinets, and the moment he whispered, "Find the deed before he gets back," every second unfolded in complete silence, except for the sound. Coming from the video itself, neither of them had an explanation that matched what everyone could plainly see. The officers' reports, the photographs of the damaged office, and the preserved text messages formed a timeline that was difficult to challenge. My mother's repeated claims that they had been helping organize paperwork collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. When the legal process concluded, they were held responsible for the unlawful entry into private areas of my home, the damage they caused, and the intimidation of my minor son. More importantly, the The court issued protective orders that ensured they could no longer enter my property or contact my son without strict legal consequences. I never celebrated. There was no satisfaction in watching my own family face judgment. The only moment that mattered came after everything was over. My son walked into my office, looked at the repaired shelves and neatly organized files, then asked quietly, "They're not coming back, are they?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "No," I told him. "This house belongs to the people who protect it." He nodded, the fear finally leaving his eyes. And for me, that quiet moment was worth more than any victory a courtroom could ever deliver. News of what happened spread through the family far faster than I expected. Relatives who had spent years telling me to keep the peace suddenly discovered there was a difference between a family disagreement and threatening a child. Some quietly apologized for dismissing my concerns in the past. Others avoided calling altogether, unwilling to admit they had defended my mother and Ryan without knowing the truth. Ryan's reputation changed almost overnight. The same people who had always described him as unlucky began to see a pattern instead of a series of accidents. Trust, once broken by undeniable evidence, proved impossible to rebuild. The greatest change, however, happened inside my own home. My son no longer jumped whenever the doorbell rang. He stopped asking whether we should hide important papers before visitors came over. Little by little, the house felt like ours again, instead of a place waiting for another invasion. As for me, I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could endure for other people's comfort. For years, I believed being the responsible one meant absorbing every insult in silence. I finally understood that real strength isn't carrying someone else's bad choices. It is refusing to let those choices define your life. If there's one reason this story matters, it's because betrayal rarely begins with one dramatic moment. It grows through the small excuses we make for people we love. The day we stop confusing loyalty with surrender is often the day our lives begin to change. Months have passed since the day I walked through my front door and found my family searching for a deed they believed would change their lives. In the end, the document they wanted was never the most valuable thing inside that house. Peace was. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. My son laughs more now. He invites friends over without asking if the doors should stay locked. We planted a maple tree in the backyard where Emily once dreamed of building a garden, and every weekend we spend a little time caring for it together. Watching it take root reminds me that healing isn't sudden. It grows one steady day at a time. I no longer carry the weight of proving I'm the good son. That burden belonged to a version of me who believed love had to be earned through endless sacrifice. Now I understand that respect and trust are not gifts. You owe someone simply because you share a last name. I still think about my mother and Ryan from time to time, but not with anger. Anger keeps the past alive. Distance allows it to remain where it belongs. The house feels different now. The walls haven't changed, but the fear has disappeared. Every room once again holds memories instead of questions. If my son remembers anything from this chapter of our lives, I hope it isn't the betrayal. I hope he remembers that kindness should never require surrender, that calm can be stronger than rage, and that protecting the people you love is sometimes the quietest decision you'll ever make. Because in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't watching them lose the house they wanted. It was making sure they could never take away the home we refused to stop protecting.